In the summer of 1772, the quiet waters of Narragansett Bay erupted with an act so bold, so defiant, that it shook the very foundations of British authority in America. This was not a skirmish of muskets or a battlefield drenched in blood, but rather a fiery spark that ignited the restless spirit of rebellion. The burning of His Majesty's schooner Gaspee was more than a crime against the Crown. It was a declaration, whispered by colonists yet thunderous in its defiance. At nightfall, men of Rhode Island carved their names into history, proving that freedom would not be begged. It would be taken. If this daring act of resistance excites you, imagine how many more hidden stories of courage shaped America's fight for liberty. Comment below. Do you think the Gaspee Affair deserves the same recognition as the Boston Tea Party? Share your thoughts, hit that subscribe button, and join our growing community uncovering the raw, untold truths of history. By the early 1770s, the American colonies were simmering under the weight of British rule. Taxes, restrictions on trade, and the heavy hand of the Crown made daily life difficult for merchants and sailors alike. Rhode Island, with its thriving maritime culture, was no stranger to clashes with authority. Smuggling was not just common, it was practically a way of life. To many colonists, Britain's navigation acts were less a matter of law and more an obstacle to be outsmarted. The British government, however, saw things differently. Determined to crack down on smuggling, it stationed customs officials and Royal Navy vessels along the coast. One such vessel was His Majesty's schooner Gaspee, commanded by Lieutenant William Duddingston. The Gaspee was not just another patrol boat. It was a symbol of British intrusion into colonial life, a constant reminder that the King's hand reached deep into American waters. Lieutenant Duddingston was no man of charm or diplomacy. His reputation quickly grew dark among Rhode Islanders. He enforced customs duties with ruthless zeal, stopping ships on the bay, searching their cargoes, and often humiliating their captains. Merchants who had grown used to slipping past regulations now found themselves trapped under his watchful eye. Worse still, Duddingston seemed to delight in his authority. His seizures were frequent, and his arrogance undeniable. It was not long before whispers began to spread through taverns and marketplaces. The Gaspee must be stopped, some said. Others muttered that Duddingston was provoking trouble, daring the colonists to act. The air grew heavy with tension, as though the bay itself waited for a storm. On June 9, 1772, events took their decisive turn. The merchant vessel Hannah sailed up Narragansett Bay from Newport toward Providence. Duddingston, ever eager to enforce the King's laws, ordered the Gaspee to pursue. The schooner, swift and nimble, gave chase. Yet the tide was low, and the waters near Warwick were treacherous. In his determination to catch the Hannah, Duddingston miscalculated. With a grinding crash, the Gaspee ran aground on a sandbar. The ship was trapped. No amount of effort could free her until the tide rose again. The once feared vessel now sat helpless, exposed like prey awaiting the hunter's strike. Word spread quickly, carried by sailors and whispered through the streets of Providence. This was the chance Rhode Islanders had waited for. That evening, a drumbeat of rebellion echoed through the town. Prominent citizens and fiery young men gathered at the home of Sabin Tavern, a popular meeting place in Providence. At their head was John Brown, a wealthy merchant known for both his influence and his boldness. Alongside him was Abraham Whipple, a veteran sailor and man of action. The plan was whispered, then declared. They would attack the Gaspee before she could free herself. As darkness fell, longboats were readied. Men armed themselves with muskets, cutlasses, and determination. This was no spontaneous riot. It was a calculated strike against a hated enemy. For many, the risk was enormous. Attacking a Royal Navy vessel was treason, punishable by death. Yet their anger outweighed their fear. The Crown had gone too far, and now Rhode Island would answer. Under cover of night, the raiders rowed silently toward their target. The outline of the stranded schooner loomed against the moonlit sky. The stillness of the bay was broken only by the creak of oars and the occasional splash of water. As they drew closer, voices carried across the water. A sentry aboard the Gaspee spotted the approaching boats and called out, demanding to know their purpose. The reply was swift and fierce. Shots rang out. Lieutenant Dudingston himself was struck and wounded, collapsing on deck as chaos erupted. The colonists swarmed aboard, overpowering the crew. For the sailors of the Gaspee, there was little hope of resistance. Outnumbered and unprepared, they surrendered. But the raiders were not finished. With the crew secured, the colonists set about their true task. Torches were brought aboard, flames licking hungrily at the wood. Soon, fire consumed the schooner. The night sky glowed with the blaze, reflected in the dark waters of the bay. By morning, nothing remained of the Gaspee but smoldering wreckage. News of the attack spread with astonishing speed. To the colonists, it was a triumph, a moment of pride whispered with excitement in taverns and marketplaces. But to the British Crown it was a shocking insult. Never before had Americans so boldly attacked a Royal Navy vessel. This was no simple act of vandalism, it was rebellion. The Crown's response was swift and furious. A royal commission was established to investigate the affair. Those responsible were to be identified, arrested, and sent to England for trial. Yet the colonists closed ranks, refusing to betray their neighbors. Witnesses were scarce, and those who knew the names of the raiders kept silent. The spirit of solidarity ran deep, and the Crown found itself frustrated at every turn. Though no one was ever punished, the Gaspee Affair marked a turning point in America's road to independence. It proved that the colonists were willing to act, not merely complain, not merely petition, but strike directly at the king's power. It also revealed the growing unity among them. Rhode Islanders, merchants, sailors, and farmers alike stood together in defiance. Historians often compare the Gaspee Affair to the Boston Tea Party, which followed the next year. While the Tea Party gained greater fame, the Gaspee's destruction came first. It was a spark, small but fierce, that lit the way toward revolution. Today the Gaspee Affair is remembered not only as an act of rebellion, but as a testament to the courage of ordinary men. They were not generals or statesmen, but townsmen who chose to risk everything for liberty. Their fire on Narragansett Bay would echo across the colonies, joining with other acts of defiance to form the chorus of revolution. The British believed fear would keep America loyal, but instead, their heavy hand forged resolve. The burning of the Gaspee was not the end of oppression, but it was proof that the colonists would no longer bow quietly. The flame that consumed the schooner was the same flame that would, in time, consume an empire's control over its colonies. History is not just about battles and treaties, it's about fiery choices that shaped nations. The Gaspee Affair was one such choice. But do you think it deserves the same spotlight as the Boston Tea Party? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's debate history together, and don't forget to hit subscribe for more untold truths of the past. Flames of the Gaspee had long since been doused by the waters of Narragansett Bay, but the echoes of that night thundered far louder than the crackle of burning timbers. In Providence, whispers of the raid spread like wildfire. Men who had rode into the darkness under John Brown and Abraham Whipple returned quietly to their homes, blending into the daily rhythms of colonial life, as though nothing unusual had transpired. Yet everyone knew. Shopkeepers, sailors, ministers, and even children carried the tale. Still, an unspoken code bound them. Silence. No one named names. No one pointed fingers. If British authorities asked, they shrugged. If gossip pushed too hard, voices lowered. The community understood that the attack had been a collective act, even if only a few had wielded torches. To betray the raiders would be to betray Rhode Island itself. In London, news of the affair was received with outrage. To the Crown, this was no ordinary disturbance. It was an attack on His Majesty's Navy, an institution symbolizing the very heart of British power. Ministers were appalled not just at the destruction of the schooner, but at the brazenness of it. Colonists had dared to board, wound a royal officer, humiliate the crew, and burn the ship in full view of the night sky. Such defiance could not go unanswered. King George III's administration ordered a full investigation. A royal commission of inquiry was established. Its task both simple and daunting: identify the culprits, arrest them, and transport them across the Atlantic to stand trial in England for treason. It was an assertion of imperial authority, a reminder that the colonies were not beyond the king's reach. But this demand, trial in England, was gasoline poured on already glowing embers. Colonists had long believed that they were entitled to the rights of Englishmen, including trial by a jury of peers in their own colony. To drag men from Rhode Island and try them in distant London was, in their eyes, tyranny made flesh. The commission convened in Newport in early 1773, staffed by judges and officials loyal to the crown. Its presence sent a chill through the colony. Rumors swirled that ships waited in the harbor to whisk away suspects, that spies roamed the taverns, that informants could be rewarded handsomely for betraying the raiders. Yet despite the tension, the commission struggled. Witnesses appeared, but their words danced around the truth. Sailors admitted hearing gunfire that night, but they had not seen the faces. Townsfolk acknowledged that boats had launched from Providence, but they could not name the men aboard. Even those who had surely recognized neighbors or friends kept their lips sealed. One name was whispered repeatedly: John Brown. His wealth, his influence, and his open defiance of British trade laws made him an obvious suspect. But without testimony, without confession, the commission was powerless. No indictment could stand on rumor alone. The colonists' solidarity had beaten the Crown's machinery of justice. Lieutenant William Duddingston, commander of the Gaspee, did not fade quietly from the tale. Wounded during the raid, he recovered slowly and bitterly. To him, the attack was more than an insult. It was a personal humiliation. He had been shot and bested by colonial smugglers, men he considered beneath him. His testimony before the commission was fierce, but it lacked the one thing Britain demanded: names. Ironically, Duddingston's reputation may have contributed to the silence. His cruelty and arrogance had made him widely hated in Rhode Island. Merchants despised his relentless seizures of their ships, sailors cursed his intrusions, and even those uninvolved with smuggling saw him as a bully in uniform. Few were eager to defend him, and fewer still to help avenge him. The Gaspee Affair resonated beyond Rhode Island. In Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, colonists watched closely. Newspapers carried reports of the burning, and commentators debated its meaning. Some hailed it as an act of heroic defiance, a symbol that Americans would not tolerate tyranny. Others feared that such violence would provoke harsher retaliation from Britain. Committees of correspondence, newly forming networks of colonial communication, buzzed with the news. Letters crossed colonies, carrying both alarm and admiration. For the first time, the destruction of a British vessel by colonists was not dismissed as local mischief, but recognized as part of a growing struggle shared across all 13 colonies. By June 1773, the commission dissolved without producing a single indictment. No man was shipped to London, no trial was held. To the British government, it was a humiliation. To the colonists, it was a triumph of solidarity. Ordinary men had risen against imperial power, and the crown had failed to punish them. The lesson was clear: unity protected rebellion. If Rhode Islanders had turned against each other, the raiders would have hanged as traitors. Instead, silence was their shield, and it had proven stronger than the king's wrath. Though overshadowed in later memory by the Boston Tea Party, which erupted just a year later, the Gaspee Affair laid critical groundwork for revolution. It demonstrated that colonists were willing to take direct violent action against British authority. It proved that communities could resist not just with words but with deeds. Perhaps most importantly, it hardened attitudes toward imperial power. The Crown's insistence on overseas trials, its heavy-handed investigation, and its inability to secure justice all fed the growing belief that reconciliation was impossible. Britain saw the colonists as subjects to be controlled. The colonists increasingly saw themselves as a people yearning for self-rule. In the years that followed, the Gaspee Affair was celebrated in Rhode Island as a badge of honor. Parades, anniversaries, and retellings kept the story alive. Even as the revolution unfolded and the colonies united in independence, Rhode Islanders reminded the new nation that their fire had come first, before the tea was dumped into Boston Harbor, before shots rang at Lexington and Concord. The affair also grew in symbolic meaning. It was remembered not just as an act against one arrogant lieutenant, but as the moment when colonists collectively decided that obedience to tyranny was no longer acceptable. The men who rode into the bay that night had risked everything. Their bravery lived on not in their names, most of which remained unspoken, but in their legacy. The Gaspee Affair sits at a fascinating crossroads in history. It was both local and national, both spontaneous and calculated. It involved ordinary men but carried extraordinary consequences. In its smoke and fire, one can glimpse the birth of a revolution still gathering strength. When historians look back at the long chain of causes leading to 1776, the Gaspee shines as an early link, fiery, defiant, and unforgettable. The bay may have returned to calm waters, but beneath that surface, the tide of rebellion surged, unstoppable. The Gaspee Affair wasn't just a local clash. It was a warning shot echoing across the colonies. But here's the real question. Was it the true spark before the revolution, even more important than the Boston Tea Party? Comment below with your take, join the debate, and make sure to subscribe for more hidden history that textbooks often overlook. By the dawn of 1773, the embers of the Gaspee Affair still glowed beneath the calm surface of colonial life. No one had been punished, no names had been betrayed, and yet the entire British Empire felt the sting of humiliation. What had happened in the quiet waters of Narragansett Bay was not forgotten. It was whispered about in homes, retold in taverns, and shared in letters across the colonies. Though the Boston Tea Party would later eclipse it in fame, the Gaspee Affair was the first real blood in the water. Lieutenant Duddingston A.S. wound and the fiery destruction of a Royal Navy schooner marked an undeniable shift. Colonists were not merely protesting taxes or writing pamphlets, they were striking directly at Britain's military power. News traveled by horse, by ship, and by word of mouth. Rhode Island's daring act was discussed in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York. The colonies, often divided by region, religion, and economy, found a common thread in the tale of the Gaspee. The story grew with each telling. Some described a dramatic midnight assault, others painted the flames as high as the heavens, visible for miles. Even where details blurred, the meaning remained sharp. Ordinary colonists had defied His Majesty's authority and gotten away with it. If Rhode Islanders could stand against the crown and escape punishment, perhaps others could as well. In London, the Gaspee Affair raised troubling questions. How strong was the crown's grip on its colonies? Could imperial law be enforced if local populations refused to cooperate? The failure of the Royal Commission to convict anyone underscored the problem. British authority depended not only on ships and soldiers, but also on colonial compliance. When entire communities closed ranks, even the most powerful empire faltered. Officials worried about precedent. If such acts went unchecked, would they multiply? Would Boston merchants, Pennsylvania farmers, or Virginia planters see the Gaspee raid as a model? Fear crept into imperial calculations, and fear in turn led to harsher policies. For the colonists, the Gaspee Affair revealed something essential. Unity was their strongest weapon. It wasn't muskets that protected John Brown, Abraham Whipple, and the unnamed raiders. It was silence, solidarity, and shared purpose. Neighbors protected neighbors, and townsfolk refused to betray their own. This lesson spread far beyond Rhode Island. When Samuel Adams and other Massachusetts radicals organized committees of correspondence, they often pointed to Rhode Island's success. If unity had shielded the Gaspee raiders, unity could shield Boston's rebels as well. The committees themselves became one of the most powerful engines of revolution. Letters and reports passed rapidly between colonies, carrying not only information, but also encouragement. The Gaspee Affair, once a Rhode Island episode, became part of a shared American narrative. While Rhode Islanders basked in their defiance, Parliament sought new ways to assert control. The Tea Act of 1773 attempted to rescue the struggling East India Company by granting it the right to sell tea directly to the colonies, undercutting colonial merchants. To British lawmakers, it was a practical economic measure. To colonists, it was yet another reminder that Parliament imposed policies without colonial consent. In Boston, resentment boiled. Men who had read about the Gaspee Affair saw that destruction of property was a powerful statement. When British tea-ships anchored in the harbor, radicals began to wonder, could the Rhode Island model be repeated? Could bold defiance achieve what petitions never had? Thus, when Bostonians disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians and dumped tea into the harbor in December 1773, they walked a path first lit by Rhode Island's flames. The Tea Party would become the more iconic protest, but its roots dug deep into the muddy sandbars of Narragansett Bay. The Crown misread both events. The Gaspee Affair had been treated as criminal vandalism, while the Boston Tea Party was viewed as a direct attack on imperial authority. Harsh punishments followed Boston's defiance, the coercive acts known to Americans as the Intolerable Acts. But in both cases, Britain failed to understand the growing American mindset. Resistance was no longer about taxes or ships, but about liberty itself. The Gaspee Affair demonstrated that colonists could resist and survive. The Boston Tea Party proved that resistance could spread like fire. Together they convinced many Americans that rebellion was not only possible, but necessary. As the revolution gained momentum, battles like Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill dominated the memory of the people. The Boston Tea Party was retold in patriotic stories, taught to children as the great prelude to independence. The Gaspee Affair, meanwhile, faded into partial obscurity, remembered mainly in Rhode Island. But obscurity did not diminish its importance. The Gaspee Affair was a rehearsal, a test of courage, and a demonstration that British authority could be directly challenged. Without it, the colonists might not have had the confidence to escalate their defiance in Boston, or to stand firm when redcoats marched into their towns. Though most of the raiders' names remained secret during their lifetimes, later generations uncovered some identities. John Brown emerged as a leader, bold enough to risk both wealth and reputation. Abraham Whipple, already known as a skilled sailor, embodied the seafaring defiance of Rhode Island. Yet the true strength of the raid lay not in leaders but in the collective. Dozens of unnamed men rode into danger, their anonymity shielding the act with a protective fog. This anonymity became part of the legend. The Gaspee Affair was not about one man's defiance but about a community's choice to resist. The faceless courage of its participants reflected the faceless determination of the colonies as a whole. In hindsight, the Gaspee Affair appears as a hinge moment in American history. Before it, resistance had been mostly economic and rhetorical. Boycotts, petitions, and fiery pamphlets. After it, resistance became physical, violent, and irreversible. A line had been crossed. For the British, it was a sign that colonial unrest was spiraling out of control. For the colonists, it was proof that they could wound the empire without being crushed. The affair stood as both warning and inspiration. The burning of the Gaspee in 1772 was not just an isolated act of defiance. It was a prophecy. It foretold a revolution that would erupt within just 3 years, a struggle that would topple an empire's hold over 13 colonies. The men who set that schooner ablaze may not have known it, but they were lighting the fuse of history. And while the Boston Tea Party stole the spotlight, the Gaspee Affair had already shown the colonies the way. Fire on the bay, silence in the courts, unity in the face of tyranny. These were the lessons that carried into the revolution. In every revolution, there is a first daring step. For America, one of those first steps came not in Boston, but on the sands of Warwick, Rhode Island, where a schooner named Gaspee met its fiery end. Every revolution begins with a spark. But which one truly set America ablaze? Was it Boston's Tea Party or was it Rhode Island's Gaspee Affair? Share your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your verdict. Don't forget to subscribe, because together we uncover the buried chapters of history that textbooks only skim. Let's keep history alive. By 1774, the American colonies stood on the brink of open war. Britain's coercive acts had turned Boston into a military garrison. Committees of correspondence were weaving networks of resistance, and the Continental Congress was convening to unite the colonies. Amid this growing storm, the Gaspee Affair remained a quiet ember, less celebrated than the Boston Tea Party, yet deeply embedded in the consciousness of those who remembered it. The burning of the Gaspee was not just an act of defiance, it was the template for what followed. It proved that British power was not invincible, that colonial unity could shield rebels from punishment, and that violence against royal authority could become a collective statement rather than a criminal act. The Boston Tea Party of December 1773, often regarded as the more dramatic prelude to revolution, borrowed heavily from the spirit of Rhode Island's defiance. But without the Gaspee Affair, Boston's radicals might have lacked the confidence to escalate their protest from speeches and petitions to direct destruction of British property. This progression from words to deeds is what historians often call the radicalization of resistance. Before the Gaspee, rebellion lived mainly on paper, resolutions, pamphlets, and boycotts. After it, resistance gained muscle, oars, and torches. The Tea Party was not an isolated act of imagination. It was a continuation of a trajectory set by the flames of Narragansett Bay. The British government, meanwhile, misunderstood the significance of both events. London saw the Gaspee Affair as a local disturbance, a colony of smugglers resisting lawful authority. They treated the Boston Tea Party as a more organized insult, but still underestimated its broader meaning. Both incidents, however, were not local protests but rehearsals for independence. By dismissing the Gaspee as maritime vandalism and failing to punish its perpetrators, Britain sent two dangerous signals. First, that colonial unity could withstand imperial investigation, and second, that violence might succeed where petitions failed. Far from calming rebellion, the British response encouraged it. For Rhode Islanders, memory of the Gaspee became a point of pride. In taverns and town squares, men spoke of the raid with satisfaction, even if their lips never revealed names. Families told children stories of boats pushing into the night, of a hated schooner burning like a beacon of freedom. Yet, outside Rhode Island, the affair slowly slipped into the background. Massachusetts dominated the headlines with its Tea Party, and later its bloodshed at Lexington and Concord. Virginia commanded attention with Patrick Henry's fiery speeches. Pennsylvania and New York drew eyes with their bustling debates. The smaller colonies' bold defiance was overshadowed, though never erased. What made the Gaspee Affair so significant, however, was its legal context. Britain had attempted to enforce maritime law through an unpopular officer, Lieutenant William Duddingston. His aggression provoked resentment, but the colonists' refusal to betray the raiders during the Royal Commission investigation marked a crucial moment. It was not just an act of resistance, but an act of nullification. The King's justice had come to Rhode Island, and Rhode Island had quietly sent it away empty-handed. This legal failure showed that colonial communities could defy imperial authority not only with torches, but with collective silence. By 1772 and 1773, committees of correspondence were forming across the colonies. Samuel Adams in Massachusetts, Richard Henry Lee in Virginia, and other radicals saw communication as essential to resistance. The Gaspee Affair gave these committees one of their first major stories to share. Letters described how Rhode Island men had struck at the Royal Navy and evaded punishment. This circulation turned a local incident into a continental lesson. What happened in Warwick was no longer Rhode Island's secret. It was America's inheritance. It told other colonies, if we stand together, Britain cannot break us apart. The Gaspee Affair's place in the Revolution, timeline June 1772. Gaspee burned in Rhode Island. December 1773, Boston Tea Party. Spring 1774, coercive acts passed, inflaming the colonies. September 1774, First Continental Congress meets. April 1775, shots fired at Lexington and Concord. The Gaspee Affair was the opening note of a symphony that would soon crescendo into war. Without it, the rhythm of resistance might have sounded differently, perhaps slower, perhaps more cautious. Instead, it pulsed with boldness. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Gaspee Affair was the secrecy that shielded its participants. Despite threats of royal prosecution and promises of reward, Not a single Rhode Islander revealed the identities of the raiders. Even decades later, many names were remembered only in family circles, whispered long after independence had been won. This silence was not cowardice. It was defiance. It reflected a community-IS shared belief that the Crown IS authority had no moral claim over them. Every tongue that stayed still was itself a weapon of resistance. When war finally came in 1775, the lessons of the Gaspee Affair were not forgotten. Colonists knew that unity was survival, that Britain's power could be challenged, and that local acts of defiance could ripple across the continent. Rhode Islanders, when they later fought at Bunker Hill, Saratoga, and Yorktown, carried with them the memory of their first victory, one without a battlefield but with fire and conviction. The revolution was not born in a single moment but in a series of escalating acts of courage. The Gaspee Affair was one such act, quietly monumental, fiercely symbolic. Today, the Gaspee Affair still lives in Rhode Island's annual commemorations. Each June, communities reenact the burning, reminding new generations that the revolution was not solely Boston's triumph or Virginia's or Pennsylvania's, but also Rhode Island's. It was small colonies, small towns, and ordinary men who made extraordinary choices. Though history books often spotlight the Boston Tea Party as the defining act of colonial rebellion, the Gaspee Affair remains the earlier and perhaps purer expression of the same spirit. It lacked disguises, it lacked theatrics. It was simply defiance, plain and unmasked. The Gaspee Affair, 1772, stands as one of the revolution's forgotten beginnings. It was not the loudest act, nor the bloodiest, but it was among the boldest. When Rhode Islanders set fire to that schooner, they were not just destroying a ship, they were declaring a truth, that liberty mattered more than law, that freedom burned brighter than empire. From that night onward, the tide of history could not be turned back. The Gaspee burned, the silence held, and the revolution crept ever closer. Without that act of fire on the bay, the road to independence might have been longer, dimmer, or delayed. But with it, the colonies had taken one step closer to destiny. Before we uncover the shocking final consequences of the Gaspee Affair, I challenge you to reflect. Was this the spark that lit the American Revolution? Comment your opinion below. I'll be watching closely. And don't forget to subscribe for more Untold history. Your thoughts fuel this journey, and your voice matters in keeping history alive. The destruction of HMS Gaspee was not just a single act of rebellion. It was a moment that rippled across the Atlantic world, transforming whispers of discontent into shouts of defiance. In this final part of the story, we explore the aftermath, the consequences, the investigations, the rising anger, and how this single event would push the colonies toward a full-scale revolution against Britain. When dawn broke on June 10, 1772, the charred remains of the Gaspee were visible on the waters near Warwick. For the local colonists, there was pride mixed with fear. Pride, because they had successfully defied the authority of the Crown by destroying one of its armed vessels. Fear, because they knew the punishment for such a bold act could be severe. Treason, after all, carried the death penalty. Royal officials in Rhode Island wasted no time. Governor Joseph Wanton, although sympathetic to the colonists in some respects, was under heavy pressure from London. He was tasked with finding and punishing the men responsible. But here lay the problem. Almost everyone in Providence and surrounding towns either participated in the attack or knew someone who did. A wall of silence fell over the community. Witnesses who were questioned suddenly claimed to have seen nothing. Others deliberately confused officials with contradictory accounts. The colonial spirit of unity was strong, and the people understood that protecting their neighbors was, in essence, protecting their own liberty. In London, news of the Gaspee's destruction was met with outrage. To British officials, this was not merely an act of vandalism, it was a direct assault on the king's authority. The burning of the Gaspee was seen as far worse than protests over taxes or smuggling. It was a military vessel, representing the Crown's power at sea, and its destruction was an unmistakable declaration of resistance. The Privy Council ordered a full investigation. King George III himself approved a commission of inquiry, which was granted extraordinary powers. This commission could bypass colonial courts and send suspects directly to England for trial, a move that horrified many colonists. They saw it as stripping them of their rights as Englishmen, which guaranteed trial by local juries. The announcement of this royal commission only deepened resentment in Rhode Island. To the colonists, it seemed that Britain was not merely trying to punish criminals, but was trying to impose fear and crush resistance entirely. Despite intense efforts, the Royal Commission struggled. Eyewitnesses refused to cooperate. Town leaders, many of whom had quietly supported the raid, gave evasive answers. Even Governor Wanton seemed reluctant to push too hard. He knew that pursuing justice too aggressively could spark further unrest. One name that surfaced during the inquiry was John Brown, a wealthy merchant of Providence and one of the most influential men in Rhode Island. Many believed he had played a leading role in organizing the attack. But Brown was untouchable. His status and wealth gave him protection, and there was no hard evidence that could tie him directly to the burning. Another man implicated was Abraham Whipple, a future naval hero of the Revolution. Whipple was accused of commanding the longboats that led the attack, but again there was no proof strong enough to convict him. The commission questioned dozens of colonists, but the coordinated silence of the community proved impossible to break. In the end, not a single person was convicted, and no colonist was ever sent to England for trial. The royal inquiry collapsed in failure, further embarrassing British officials. For many colonists, the failure of the investigation was a victory. It showed that when communities stood united, even the power of the crown could be resisted. The Gaspee Affair became a symbol of defiance, a story retold in taverns, churches, and town meetings. But the event also revealed something deeper: the widening gulf between Britain and her colonies. Where British officials saw criminality, colonists saw patriotism. Where Britain demanded obedience, colonists demanded liberty. The idea that men could be hauled across the ocean to face trial in England became a rallying cry. Colonists asked, if they can do this in Rhode Island, what will stop them from doing it everywhere? One of the most lasting impacts of the Gaspee Affair was the spread of colonial unity. In response to the threat of being tried overseas, colonists began forming committees of correspondence, groups dedicated to sharing information and organizing resistance across different colonies. These committees would become the backbone of revolutionary communication. Through letters, pamphlets, and meetings, they spread the word of British injustice. The Gaspee Affair was one of the first major issues these committees seized upon, and it galvanized their efforts. Like Samuel Adams in Massachusetts and Patrick Henry in Virginia, pointed to Rhode Island as proof that Britain was willing to trample colonial rights. The colonies could no longer see their grievances as isolated incidents. Instead, they realized they were part of a larger struggle against tyranny. In the grand sweep of history, the Gaspee Affair may seem small compared to the Boston Tea Party, the battles of Lexington and Concord, or the Declaration of Independence. But in truth, it was a critical turning point. The affair tested the limits of British authority in the colonies, and Britain failed the test. It revealed the colonists' willingness to take violent action against symbols of imperial power. It exposed the inability of the crown to enforce its will when communities resisted together. And it planted the seeds of unity that would blossom into full rebellion just 3 years later. For Rhode Island, the burning of the Gaspee became a badge of honor. John Brown and Abraham Whipple went on to become prominent figures in the Revolution, helping to finance and lead the cause of independence. The men who once rowed under cover of darkness to destroy a hated vessel would soon row proudly under the banner of a new nation. The Gaspee Affair also highlighted a crucial theme of the American Revolution: the clash between local autonomy and imperial control. Colonists believed that their rights were rooted in their own communities and assemblies. Britain believed that authority flowed downward from the king and parliament. This fundamental disagreement made compromise almost impossible. Every new attempt by Britain to enforce its authority, whether through taxes, courts, or commissions, only deepened colonial suspicion. Every act of resistance by the colonists confirmed Britain's belief that rebellion was spreading. The destruction of the Gaspee was thus not an isolated spark, but part of a chain reaction. From the Stamp Act to the Townshend Acts, From the Gaspee to the Tea Party, from Boston to Philadelphia, the road to revolution was being paved one act of defiance at a time. Looking back, one might ask, was the destruction of the Gaspee justified? To the colonists, the answer was clear. They saw it not as a crime, but as an act of justice against a corrupt and oppressive system. To Britain, it was an outrageous attack on the king's authority. What is undeniable is that the Gaspee Affair marked a shift. It was no longer about taxes on tea or stamps on paper. It was about power, sovereignty, and the right of a people to govern themselves. The men who boarded the Gaspee knew they were risking their lives. In their courage, we can glimpse the determination that would carry a revolution to victory. By the time the revolution officially erupted in 1775, the Gaspee Affair had already etched itself into the memory of American resistance. It taught the colonies that unity could defeat authority, that silence could shield freedom, and that courage could light the way to independence. In burning the Gaspee, the colonists sent a message not only to Britain but to themselves. The road to liberty was open, though it would be paved with risk and sacrifice. That night in 1772, as flames rose into the Rhode Island sky, so too did the first flames of American independence.